You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pamela Kreiser, and welcome back to NCR 507, Research, Design, and Interpretation. Now today we're going to talk about two important relationship tests. We're going to talk about regression, and then we're going to also talk about multiple regression. Now as we go through these two topics, of course we're going to be dealing on a very basic level. And so as you might get interested in this topic, please know that there's many more tutorials to take to understand these designs. Now we start all of these discussions by looking at the models that we analyze for this class. So let's take a look at this chart and understand where regression and multiple regression fits in. So here we see the chart that shows the models that we're covering in our class, and we see that these are the last two models, the idea of looking at regression and multiple regression. And here we note that the variables are continuous, and we saw this for all of the relationship tests, that we see they need or require continuous variables. And that's to capture the variance as we look at the nuances of those related variables. Now, as we see this, of course, we want to remind ourselves these are the difference tests, right? And these are the relationship tests. And so as we note that, then we're able to kind of distinguish the three difference tests and then there's three relationship tests. And so we'll take a look now into regression and into multiple regression that requires continuous data. So let's talk about regression a little bit. When we think about regression, we actually have a name for it called simple bivariate linear regression, which I know is great to have the word simple there, right? But it is actually simple. It just means that we're going to look at a regression model for two variables. So it's linear, so we know that about regression. Same for multiple regression, that we're looking at a linear model. And we're looking at two continuous variables. We're trying to understand the regression relationship between them. And as we analyze it, then we're going to do this thing called assigning causality. And that is a tough one because remember, as we saw in correlation, we cannot assign a causal relationship to a correlation. So we can't do the same thing either for linear regression, but we can actually try to assign it or try to isolate it so that we can look at the variance accounted for in that model. Now, one of the differences between regression and multiple regression is simply that there is one independent variable in the simple bivariate linear regression, and then we know in multiple regression, the word multiple implies multiple independent variables. So as you remember those two, that's a good way to distinguish it. So let's talk about a couple of the assumptions that are in the regression models. One is that both variables, the dependent variable and the independent or independent, multiple independent variables are continuous. We say that the sample is random, so we have randomly collected the data. We know that the scores have to be collected on all of the variables that we're analyzing in the relationship, so we can't have missing data. And then we also know that the dependent variable needs to be normally distributed and the population variance relatively the same for the independent variables. So as we think about those assumptions, then those are the basic background understanding that we have as a researcher when we're conducting this kind of a model. Now, let's take a look at the next slide to show us a model of what would be the idea of a simple bivariate linear regression. Now here we are able to see a visual depiction of the study that we are conducting in front of us, and that is to have the independent variable of the length of mediation and to look and see if it predicts a change in the dependent variable, which is the perceived effectiveness. And so the question I'm asking is there a relationship between the length of mediation in minutes, right here, is that a predictor of whether one will perceive the mediation to be effective or not? And so as we look at this, we see bivariate, which means two variables, and we see linear, which means that it is a linear model, and then we see regression. Now notice this is not correlation because we are looking at this impact, the impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable. And how we do that is look at the variance accounted for. So as we look at this model, we can see that it's showing us this idea that we have a regression model and we're looking to see if length of mediation is a significant predictor. So let's go to the next slide, which shows us the data. Okay, so here I have a set of data, and you can see that I have lots of sessions here. And then I have communication apprehension here. I have the length of mediation here. I have a number of different variables. Here's effectiveness, here's cost, here's mediation training, I believe. And as we take a look at this, we can see there's lots of different variables. Now, our task on this first regression model is we're just looking to see if this variable influences this variable. So we're looking to see a regressional relationship between this length of mediation as the independent variable and effectiveness as the dependent variable. So let's go on to the next slide. Now, if I ran the regression model, and that's with one predictor, that's the length of mediation, I would get output files. And this is the first set of boxes that I would get in the output file. And you can look at my separate video on how to conduct this on SPSS. So take a look at that if you want to know how to run this. So we look at the model summary first, and here it gives us a general overview of this regression relationship. And we are reminded that we have length of mediation as the predictor. And then we have two very important numbers that are stated here. We see the R and we see the R square. Now the R is the multiple correlation between the two variables. Now in our case, it's the correlation essentially between the length of mediation and the perception of effectiveness. And so we see that it's 0.374. Now we know that when we square this number, we get the variance accounted for. And so that's 0.14. And so what that actually means is that 14% of what causes you and I to judge a mediation to be effective is accounted for by the length of mediation. So think about that. The length of mediation accounts for explaining 14% of this dependent variable. So that's kind of good news that we have some variance accounted for, and we can explain that about 14% of my judgment of what is considered an effective mediation has to do with the length of mediation. Now, let's take a look down below. As we look at this, we notice, by the way, this word ANOVA, and that means the math is the same as in the ANOVA model, or relatively similar. So the model looks the same. But don't be confused, this is a regression model. And so when we look at this regression model, we see a couple of very important numbers here. We see the 1 and the 749. And so if we were writing this model up, which we'll do in a second, we would need these numbers here. We also see the F value, and then we also see the significance. So what does this ultimately, this box show? It says not only do we have this regression model above with the details listed of 14%, but we look down below and we see in the regression area that this regression model is significant. And so what does that mean? That means that length of mediation is a significant predictor of effectiveness. So let's take a look at this. If we were to write this up, it's just written up just like an ANOVA model. And so I'll do that here. So here, I have written it just like an F ratio box, like I would in ANOVA, but we know this is a regression because we've talked about that. So I take these numbers, and these are my degrees of freedom, and then I put the F value here, and then I have P is less than 0.05. So you can see here that when I write up and say the model is a significant predictive model, I would write it up just this way using the F ratio box. Now let's take a look at the next box that we would get on the output files to understand the rest of the story. Now here we see the coefficients. And so what it does then is it starts to break down the specifics of what I would know about each of my predictors. Now remember, we said that length of mediation is a significant predictor. We also see this term constant here. And the reason it's in parentheses is it's not important. So we would actually mark that out because we know it's just math for the regression model. So it's these other numbers that we care about. So here, I know that I care about 3 different numbers as I analyze my significant predictors. Okay, so I see 3 different ones. And so here I'm going to write this up and say t equals 11.02. And then in parentheses, I'm going to have p is less than 0.05. And then I'm going to have the beta weight equal 2.374. And so if I were reporting and saying that the length of mediation is a significant predictor, I would get my t value from here, my p value from here, and my beta weight from here. And that just tells you where to get the numbers from so that you can understand how to plug that in if you were making up a write-up. Now this will become clearer as we go into the multiple regression model. So let's think about that and say, you know, one of the things that I wanted to do was predict how someone judges the effectiveness of a mediation. And I found out from my study that length of mediation is a significant predictor. And I see that it's a positive predictor because I don't see any negative signs. And so I would be able to conclude from this model that length of mediation is a significant and positive predictor of effectiveness. And so I would be able to say that. But what I would in reality think is that maybe my judgment of effectiveness might actually be a larger thought. So in other words, there might be more things that contribute to what I judge to be an effective mediation session, not just one thing, like the length of mediation. So let's go to the next slide where we might see how this might look if we introduced multiple independent variables. Okay, so here we see a chart that shows you multiple independent variables. And so here's an IV, here's an IV, here's an IV, and here's an IV. And these are all independent variables. And now we're going to look at their impact on a dependent variable. Remember before we just looked at this relationship. We just looked at the length of mediation. We said 14% is accounted for by the length of mediation on what I perceive to be effective. So the question we're asking here is cost a significant predictor? We know that length of mediation is, but what does that look like when we add training hours and when we add maybe apprehension in communicating? So here we're going to look at the influence of all 4 together. And that's what's very special about multiple regression. Now there are many, many versions of multiple regression, so I'm showing you just a basic model here. But what are we looking at? We're looking at how do these 4 predict effectiveness? How do they do that together? And then also we're looking at which is the strongest predictor so that we can understand the model better. So let's take a look going forward at what might be my first output pages if I were to run a multiple regression. And keep in mind, if you did that, then you would be watching a separate video that I've taped that shows you how to do the multiple regression model. And so here we can see this R, and that's 0.507. And so we know that's the relationship between all of these variables together with the dependent variable. So all of that together, this is the correlation that they share. So that's the whole model. And then we know that now we can explain 25.7% of the variance that is effectiveness. In other words, I used to be able to explain 14% with just one predictor, but now that I've been able to move that up to 25.7. And so what does that mean? That means that I'm now able to explain 25% of the variation in the effectiveness score is due to the linear combination of these 4 variables. And so we can think about it that way. And that's just the whole model. So as we look at the model then, we look down below and we can see the dependent variable's effectiveness. And then we see that constant, which we don't have to worry about, but we see the 4 independent variables down below. Now, if we were to write this up, we would, of course, care about these numbers. So let's take a look at these. And we would write it up and say we have a significant model. In other words, we have a significant linear combination of predictors. That's a comma. Okay, so here we know the degrees of freedom are put here, right? So we have the smaller one first and then the larger one next. and that's the within, the between and within numbers. And so we have 4 and 588, and then we have the F ratio, and then we have the significance. And what is this essentially saying? It's saying that we have a significant regression model. In other words, these 4 variables are significant predictors of effectiveness when they act together. So it's the linear combination that we are talking about. Now let's go to the next box to help us understand the specifics. Now this gets a little bit more interesting than the first time we looked at it, because we're looking at, remember, we don't care about the constant. We're looking at these 4 variables. And so the first thing that I would challenge you to do is to look over on the significance box. And so as you see this, of course, this tells us which variables are significant predictors and which are not. And so we see length of mediation, again, is a significant predictor right here. And then we see also communication apprehension is a significant predictor. We don't see the other 2. Okay, so let's take a look at the other 2. This is not significant, and this is not significant. Okay, so notice that the training hours of the mediator are not significant, and the cost of the mediation is not a significant predictor. And why do we say this? Because they are greater than 0.05. And so remember, we use the p-value to determine significance, and since these numbers are higher than 0.05, we would say they are not significant. Now let's go back to our significant predictors, and that's these right here. We have length of mediation, and then we have communication apprehension. And there's something very important that you'll notice about these. Here we see a negative sign, negative, and here they are a positive sign, right? And so that's very important because we see that this is a positive predictor and this is a negative predictor. What does that mean? That it actually accounts for the variance, the change in the dependent variable, but they have a negative relationship for communication apprehension and a positive one for length of mediation. So we'll talk about that a little more in a second. Now, as we were to write these up then, we would say that we have one significant and positive predictor, okay, and that is going to be T equals, that's length of mediation, so T equals 3.487, and we would say P is less than 0.05, and then we'd also add, I'm running out of space here, the beta weight of 0.150. And so we would be able to write it up like that. This is the significant and positive predictor, the length of mediation. And so here we see the 0.15 is the beta weight here, 150. And then here we see the 3.487 right here, and then here's the significance right there. And so we see where to grab those numbers from. And we would call the length of mediation a significant and positive predictor. Now here we have communication apprehension, and we see that this is a negative predictor. So let's write that one up. And this is a negative predictor. So what does that mean? That means that when apprehension goes up, that means that the effectiveness goes down, and vice versa. So let's take a look at this T value, which is negative 9.507. And then we have the P value is less than 0.05. We know it's a significant predictor. And then the beta weight equals negative 391. And the thing that we know, of course, is that as we're evaluating these numbers, we see that this is the largest predictor. In other words, this is the one that contributes the most to the variance and the change that is in the dependent variable of effectiveness. So we see it's a negative predictor, and it is the strongest. So as you're evaluating these T values, and you can see it also reflected in the beta weights, we see that the larger the number, the larger the influence. Remember, we don't care about this top line, right? That's just mathematics. And so here we're going to see this is our number one predictor, and then this is our second predictor, but it's positive, and then we have two non-significant predictors right there. So we can see that relationship. So now if we went back a slide, and we are back 2 slides, and we were able to look at the model, we would see that cost is a non-significant predictor. We'd see length of mediation is a significant and positive predictor. Mediation training hours is a non-significant predictor, and communication apprehension is a negative predictor. And so the great thing about regression is that it helps us understand the influence of this collection of independent variables on the dependent variable, but it also shows us if we have a positive predictor right here, and if we have a negative predictor right here, and then it also tells us how strong that is. And so then one of the things that we know is that helps us understand more about these perceptions of effectiveness. And we can also determine other information from this. Like we saw that cost was not significant. So we might play around with cost associated with mediation and worry all day about it, but in this model, it actually doesn't show up as important. We might also worry about telling people how many hours of training we've had or trying to suggest that more training equals higher effectiveness, and we have not seen that in this particular model. And so I'm not saying that it doesn't matter, I'm just saying that these data don't tell us that that's an important factor. And so what it does is it indicates what is important, our positive and our negative predictor, and then it also tells us what not to worry about in terms of perceptions of effectiveness. Now, as we do all kinds of different studies, of course, we're going to have all kinds of different outcomes, but this helps us understand the basic idea behind multiple regression. So as we think about multiple regression, of course, then we see the ability for us to analyze the relationship with lots of different independent variables in the equation. And that is very exciting when we start to think about being able to predict a change on the dependent variable. And that helps us understand where we should maybe care about some of the variables, and then other times where maybe we don't need to care so much about the variables. It just helps us determine what's the most important to least. And of course, there are many other kinds of regression out there that many businesses and organizations spend a lot of time analyzing. Sometimes they analyze costs, sometimes consumer behavior. Other times they'll look at impact of discounting. Of course, all of those mathematical models are very important so that we can understand the relationship between the variables, again, as they are looked at together. Now, of course, we look at that linear combination on the dependent variable for the multiple regression, and we understand that as we look at its influence, it is initially looked at as a collective group on the dependent variable, and then we can look at the specifics of that model. So as you're thinking about regression and multiple regression, we can differentiate them by saying that the simple bivariate linear regression is the impact of one independent variable on a dependent variable. And then when we think about multiple regression, then we're thinking about multiple independent variables acting on a single dependent variable. And of course, there's many more models out there that we could look at, but we can only do a few in this class, so that's one of the important ones for us to think about. Again, when you think about those R's being in the model, we saw the big R, the large R, which is that correlation between all of the variables in the model. And remember what my tip was there, and that is to think about it as a relationship test because of that R. It reminds you that you're doing a relationship test. And then we also saw the R square, which is the indicator of the variance accounted for. In other words, how much of that dependent variable can we explain? Now, when you're writing up these results, of course, there's lots of creativity involved, but of course, we want to identify the very basic information, and that is, do you have a significant predictor? So you want to say that, and then you want to indicate if you have a significant predictor, whether it's positive or negative, and help the reader understand what that means. And so as we go through it, we can't assume that really readers understand what we mean when we talk about regression. And so what we'll say is the linear combination of the variables explains this much percentage of the dependent variable or the variance accounted for. And we'll explain it that way and try to help the reader navigate what we're saying. Then ultimately, we can look at specific predictors in that multiple regression model and understand the best way to explain those results. So that wraps up our show today on regression and multiple regression. And I hope that you have been able to see the basics of the model and how we try to assign causality by doing a predictive model, which we call regression. And I hope you'll have fun with it in your data analysis. And I also hope that your day is not just different, but significantly different.